Good evening. Tonight we're following the cinnamon-scented winds of maritime ambition. Behind every Chinese treasure ship lies a forgotten truth that Malay boat builders had been perfecting flexible hulls for millennia, before rigid European designs ever touched tropical waters. Just a story of thalassocracies, monsoon revelations, and the discovery that the world's first global civilization was built not on land, but on the shifting patterns of seasonal winds. If you find peace in these oceanic journeys, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Drop a comment about what time it is where you are. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all drifting through different hours while sharing these timeless maritime stories. So dim the lights. Let's begin with a navigator testing the wind, feeling in his bones the subtle shift that announced the approaching monsoon season. Chapter 4. The Maritime Silk Road, Navigators and Oceanic Exchange. The first light of dawn revealed what the navigator had been feeling in his bones for days, the subtle shift in wind direction that announced the approaching monsoon season. Standing on the flexible deck of his sewn plank vessel, he could sense the ocean's changing mood through the gentle flex of the hull beneath his feet, the way the lashed lug construction allowed the ship to bend and flow with the swells rather than fight them. Around him, his crew moved with the quiet efficiency of men who had spent their lives reading the sea's moods, checking the distinctive crab-claw sails that would soon carry them across thousands of miles of open water, adjusting the outrigger floats that kept their vessel stable in waters that could turn violent without warning. The air carried the mingled scents that marked a trading vessel preparing for a long voyage, cinnamon and cloves from the Spice Islands nestled in woven baskets below deck, sandalwood logs that would bring fortune in distant markets, and the ever-present salt spray that seasoned the tropical breeze. In the cargo hold, nutmeg and pepper-filled palm fiber sacks, while precious aromatics wrapped in banana leaves waited to perfume the courts of kings whose names his crew could barely pronounce. These were the treasures that justified voyages of months or even years, journeys that would take them from the familiar waters of Southeast Asia to the exotic shores of Madagascar, East Africa, or the mysterious lands beyond the Arabian Sea. This was no ordinary morning departure from a Southeast Asian port, sometime around the year 1000 CE. The navigator who stood testing the wind belonged to a maritime tradition that had been perfecting the art of ocean travel for over 3 millennia. His ancestors had been the first people in human history to deliberately cross vast expanses of open ocean, developing the technologies and knowledge that would make the maritime Silk Road possible centuries before Chinese junks or Arab dhows ventured beyond coastal waters. The vessel beneath his feet represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about how to build ships that could survive the challenges of tropical seas. Hulls sewn together with fiber rope that could flex without breaking, outrigger systems that provided stability without sacrificing speed, and sail configurations that could harness the complex wind patterns of the monsoon system. As his crew completed their preparations, the navigator performed the ancient rituals that had protected seafarers for countless generations. He made offerings to the spirits of wind and wave, burned fragrant incense to ensure favorable weather, and spoke the traditional prayers that would guide them safely across waters, where a mistake in navigation could mean death for every soul aboard. Yet these were not superstitious gestures but practical acknowledgments of the forces that governed oceanic travel, the seasonal shifts in wind direction that made certain voyages possible at certain times of year, the star patterns that provided navigation reference points across trackless seas, and the subtle ocean swells that could guide experienced navigators toward distant islands invisible beyond the horizon. The maritime Silk Road that was taking shape around this navigator's lifetime represented one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, a network of sea routes that would eventually connect every major civilization from China to Africa, enabling exchanges of goods, ideas, technologies, and cultures on a scale that would not be matched until the modern era. Unlike the overland Silk Road with its caravans and merchants passing goods from hand to hand across vast distances, the maritime routes allowed individual traders to travel the entire breadth of the known world, carrying cargoes directly from their points of origin to distant markets, while accumulating knowledge and establishing relationships that would reshape human civilization. What made this extraordinary network possible was not simply the courage of individual navigators, though courage was certainly required, but the development of sophisticated maritime technologies and navigation techniques that enabled systematic, repeated voyages across previously impossible distances. The foundation of these capabilities had been laid by the Austronesian peoples, whose expansion from Taiwan and the Philippines beginning around 3000 BCE had populated thousands of islands across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, while developing the shipbuilding techniques and navigational knowledge that would later enable merchants from many cultures to traverse the seas safely and profitably. The Austronesian Foundation Masters of Wind and Wave. Long before Chinese admirals commanded treasure fleets or Arab merchants learned to read the monsoon winds, the ancestors of today's Pacific Islanders, Malays, and Malagasy peoples had mastered the art of deliberate ocean navigation on a scale that dwarfed anything previously attempted in human history. Beginning around 3000 BCE from their homeland in Taiwan, Austronesian-speaking peoples embarked on what would become the greatest maritime expansion in human prehistory, developing the technologies and techniques that would eventually enable the maritime Silk Road to connect distant continents through systematic oceanic commerce. In the workshops of ancient Taiwan and the Philippines, master boat builders perfected construction techniques that would prove ideally suited to the challenges of tropical navigation. The distinctive lashed lug method involved creating vessels whose hulls were literally sewn together with fiber rope, allowing the entire structure to flex with ocean swells rather than fighting the water's movement. Unlike the rigid construction of Mediterranean vessels, which could crack or break apart in heavy seas, these sewn plank boats bent and twisted with each wave, making them remarkably seaworthy in the often violent conditions of tropical waters. The process of building such vessels required knowledge that had been refined over generations of maritime experience. Skilled craftsmen selected specific types of wood that would work well together, carved the distinctive lugs or cleats that gave the technique its name, and used particular varieties of fiber rope that would swell when wet to create watertight seams. The hulls were caulked with resin-based preparations made from tropical plants, while the seams between planks were sealed with tapa bark and other fibrous materials that expanded in water to further tighten the joints and keep the ocean from invading the cargo holds. The most revolutionary innovation, however, was the development of outrigger systems that solved the fundamental problem of ocean navigation: how to create vessels stable enough to survive rough seas while remaining light and fast enough to cover vast distances efficiently. By attaching lateral support floats to one or both sides of the main hull, Austronesian builders created boats that were nearly impossible to capsize while maintaining the speed necessary for long-distance voyaging. These outrigger configurations could range from small fishing canoes to large ocean-going vessels capable of carrying entire families with their livestock, food supplies, and household goods across thousands of miles of open water. Equally important was the development of sail systems specifically designed for the complex wind patterns of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The distinctive crab-claw sail, with its characteristic triangular shape supported by two converging spars, could be adjusted and rotated to catch winds from various directions while maintaining stability in rough conditions. These sails were traditionally woven from pandanus leaves, which proved remarkably durable and resistant to the salt spray and intense tropical sun that quickly destroyed other materials. Later innovations included the Tanja sail system, which provided even greater efficiency in the variable wind conditions that characterized monsoon navigation. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kuala Selinsing in Malaysia, where boat-shaped log coffins from the 1st and 2nd centuries CE preserve lashed lug construction techniques, demonstrates the antiquity and widespread distribution of these maritime technologies. Even more remarkable are the Butuan boat burials in the Philippines, where 11 separate vessels dating from 689 to 988 CE were found associated with trade goods from China, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and as distant as Persia, indicating that Austronesian merchants were regularly traveling to the Middle East over 1,000 years ago. The navigational knowledge that enabled such extraordinary voyages represented an accumulation of environmental understanding that encompassed astronomy, oceanography, meteorology, and biology in ways that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Master navigators could read the subtle patterns of ocean swells that indicated the presence of distant islands, interpret the flight patterns of seabirds that revealed the direction of land, and use star positions to maintain course across trackless waters where the slightest error could prove fatal. This knowledge was encoded in complex oral traditions that preserved not only practical navigation techniques, but also the cultural and spiritual frameworks that made long-distance voyaging psychologically possible. Navigation chants and songs contained detailed information about wind patterns, star positions, seasonal changes, and the characteristics of distant islands, while ritual practices maintained the spiritual connections between voyagers and the forces of nature that determine their success or failure. The scale of Austronesian expansion demonstrates the effectiveness of these technologies and techniques. By 1500 BCE, Austronesian voyagers had reached the Mariana Islands, a journey of over 500 kilometers from the Philippines across open ocean, likely the longest deliberate sea crossing attempted at that time. By 1000 BCE, they had colonized islands throughout Melanesia and were beginning the settlement of Polynesia, eventually reaching Easter Island in the east and New Zealand in the south. Most remarkably for the development of the maritime Silk Road, Austronesian navigators also sailed westward across the Indian Ocean, colonizing Madagascar sometime between the 1st and 6th centuries CE, and establishing the first systematic maritime connections between Southeast Asia and Africa. The Madagascar settlement represents one of the most extraordinary voyages in human history, a journey of over 6,000 kilometers across the open Indian Ocean that required not only exceptional navigational skill, but also the ability to transport sufficient people, animals, and supplies to establish permanent settlements in a new continent. The fact that Malagasy, the language of Madagascar, is clearly Austronesian rather than African, provides linguistic proof of this remarkable achievement, while the presence of Southeast Asian crops like rice and bananas in Madagascar, offers additional evidence of systematic contact between the distant regions. By the beginning of the Common Era, Austronesian maritime networks extended from Easter Island in the eastern Pacific to Madagascar in the western Indian Ocean, encompassing roughly half the planet's circumference and connecting thousands of islands through regular voyaging relationships. These networks enabled the exchange of goods, technologies, crops, animals, and ideas across distances that would challenge modern transportation systems, creating the world's first truly global civilization long before European explorers ventured beyond coastal waters. The maritime Jade Road, which operated from around 2000 BCE to 1000 CE, exemplifies the sophistication of early Austronesian commerce. This network connected jade sources in Taiwan with workshops in the Philippines and markets throughout Southeast Asia, demonstrating that systematic long-distance trade relationships existed thousands of years before the classical maritime Silk Road. The distinctive Linglingou ornaments and other jade artifacts found throughout the region provide archaeological evidence of regular commercial contacts maintained across hundreds of generations. When merchants from other cultures eventually began venturing into the Indian Ocean, they encountered not empty seas but established maritime territories controlled by peoples who had been perfecting ocean navigation for millennia. The technologies these Austronesian societies had developed, outrigger vessels, sewn plank construction, monsoon navigation, and systematic long-distance voyaging, would provide the foundation for all subsequent oceanic commerce in the region. Even when Chinese, Arab, and Indian merchants began developing their own shipping capabilities, they often adopted Austronesian techniques, or hired Austronesian navigators, whose knowledge of ocean conditions and navigation routes proved essential for successful voyaging. The monsoon revelation, when distant shores became neighbors. Sometime in the 1st century BCE, a Greek navigator sailing from an Egyptian port made a discovery that would transform the economy of the ancient world. Rather than following the traditional route that hugged the coastlines of Arabia and Persia for thousands of dangerous miles, he decided to sail directly across the open Arabian Sea, trusting in the seasonal wind patterns that local merchants had long understood, but that Mediterranean sailors had never systematically exploited. The gamble succeeded spectacularly. What had previously required months of dangerous coastal navigation could now be accomplished in a matter of weeks by riding the monsoon winds straight across the ocean's breadth. This breakthrough, attributed in ancient sources to a navigator named Hippolytus, represented more than a simple improvement in navigation efficiency. It marked the moment when the seasonal wind patterns that had long governed Indian Ocean navigation became accessible to merchants from the Mediterranean world, enabling direct trade relationships between the Roman Empire and the markets of India, while bypassing the Parthian middlemen who had previously controlled access to Eastern luxury goods. More importantly, it began the process of integrating the various regional maritime networks that had developed independently into a single transcontinental commercial system. The monsoon system that made this integration possible operates on a scale so vast that it influences weather patterns across half the planet. During the summer months, the heating of the Asian landmass creates enormous low-pressure systems that draw moisture-laden air from the Indian Ocean, generating the southwest monsoon that brings life-giving rains to India, while creating steady winds that blow from the Arabian Peninsula toward Southeast Asia. In winter, the pattern reverses as cold, dry air flows from the snow-covered Himalayas toward the warm seas, creating the northeast monsoon that blows from India toward Arabia and East Africa. For navigators who understood these patterns, the monsoons provided a natural transportation system that operated with clockwork regularity. Merchants could depart from Arabian or Persian ports in late spring, ride the southwest monsoon to India or Southeast Asia during the summer months, conduct their business during the autumn, and return home on the northeast monsoon during the winter season. This predictability allowed for systematic commercial planning on a scale that had never before been possible, enabling merchants to schedule voyages, arrange financing, and coordinate complex transactions across vast distances with confidence. Arab and Persian merchants had long understood these patterns, but the integration of monsoon navigation with Mediterranean commercial networks created unprecedented opportunities for long-distance trade. Roman merchants could now obtain Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Southeast Asian aromatics through direct maritime contacts, rather than relying on the expensive overland routes that passed through hostile territories. Indian merchants found new markets for their cotton textiles, precious stones, and metal goods in the wealthy ports of the Red Sea, while Southeast Asian traders gained access to Roman glass, precious metals, and manufactured goods that commanded premium prices in Asian markets. The port cities that emerged at the intersection of these expanding networks became some of the most cosmopolitan places in the ancient world. In Barbaricum and Barigaza on India's western coast, merchants from Rome, Persia, Arabia, and Southeast Asia established permanent trading communities, where Latin mixed with Persian, Tamil, and Malay in the multilingual conversations of international commerce. The aromatic air of these trading centers carried the sense of frankincense from Arabia, pepper from Kerala, cinnamon from Ceylon, and the distinctive smell of Chinese silk that had become synonymous with luxury throughout the civilized world. These cosmopolitan port cities required new forms of social organization that could accommodate the religious, cultural, and commercial practices of diverse trading communities. Hindu temples, Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian fire altars, and eventually Islamic mosques shared the same neighborhoods, while legal systems developed that could adjudicate commercial disputes involving parties from different cultural backgrounds operating under different legal traditions. The result was a form of practical multiculturalism driven by commercial necessity, where tolerance was literally profitable, and cultural understanding became essential for business success. The integration of monsoon navigation with established maritime networks also accelerated technological exchange on an unprecedented scale. Austronesian shipbuilders learned new construction techniques from Arab and Persian craftsmen, while Mediterranean merchants discovered the advantages of sewn plank construction and outrigger systems for tropical navigation. Chinese naval architects began adapting Indian Ocean shipbuilding methods to create vessels capable of operating in deep water, rather than the rivers and coastal waters where Chinese shipping had previously been confined. Navigation techniques similarly spread and evolved as merchants from different traditions shared their knowledge of wind patterns, current systems, and celestial navigation. The astrolabe, originally developed for astronomical observation, was adapted for maritime navigation, and became an essential tool for determining latitude on long ocean voyages. Simpler devices like the kamal, essentially a wooden board with a knotted string that could be held in the teeth and aligned with the North Star, provided practical navigation aids that could be used by less skilled sailors, while maintaining reasonable accuracy. The commercial revolution that resulted from this integration of maritime networks transformed the economies of societies throughout the Indian Ocean basin. In India's Malabar ports, pepper production expanded dramatically to meet the growing demand from Roman markets, while craftsmen developed new techniques for processing spices and aromatics to ensure quality during long sea voyages. Ceylon became a major center for cinnamon cultivation and gem cutting, while the strategic location of its ports made it an essential stopover for vessels traveling between India and Southeast Asia. The social effects of expanded maritime commerce reached every level of society in the participating regions. In port cities, international trade created new categories of employment: translators, cultural guides, commercial agents, and specialized craftsmen who could adapt products for foreign markets. Women often played crucial roles in maintaining these commercial relationships, managing household enterprises while their husbands undertook long voyages, and sometimes conducting trade directly with female merchants from other cultures. Religious and intellectual exchange accompanied commercial contacts, creating the first systematic transmission of ideas between distant civilizations. Buddhist monks from China booked passage on Austronesian vessels, which Chinese sources called Kunlun Po, to reach the holy sites of India, while Indian scholars traveled to China to study in Buddhist monasteries and libraries. Islamic traders brought their faith to Southeast Asian ports, where it often blended with local religious traditions to create distinctive regional forms of Islamic practice. The integration of monsoon navigation with established maritime networks also created the first truly global supply chains in human history. Chinese silk might be woven in Indian workshops using techniques learned from Persian craftsmen, dyed with colors extracted from Southeast Asian plants, and sold in Roman markets where it would be fashioned into garments according to Mediterranean aesthetic preferences. Similarly, spices grown in Indonesian volcanic soil might be processed in Indian ports, shipped in Arab vessels, and consumed in Chinese banquets, where they would be combined with local ingredients to create new culinary traditions. By the 7th century CE, this integrated maritime network had achieved a level of sophistication and geographic scope that would not be matched again until the modern era. Regular shipping routes connected every major port from Canton to Constantinople, while commercial relationships linked farming communities in remote valleys with urban markets thousands of miles away. The foundation had been laid for the classical maritime Silk Road, which would reach its peak during the following centuries, when powerful maritime empires began systematically organizing and protecting these oceanic trade networks. The age of thalassocracies, empires built on water. In the great harbor of Palembang, the morning light illuminated a scene that would have amazed visitors from land-based empires. Hundreds of vessels from across the known world, floating at anchor in the muddy waters of the Musi River, their diverse hull configurations and sail systems representing every major maritime tradition of the ancient world. Chinese junks with their distinctive batten sails rested alongside Arab dhows, their sewn plank hulls gleaming with fresh tar, while Austronesian vessels displayed the elegant curves of lashed lug construction and the practical efficiency of outrigger systems that had enabled their builders to colonize half the planet. This was Srivijaya, at its height in the 9th century CE, the world's first true maritime empire, a thalassocracy that controlled not territory in the traditional sense but the sea lanes themselves, exercising power through naval supremacy and commercial dominance rather than armies and fortifications. From their strategic position controlling the Strait of Malacca, the rulers of Srivijaya had created something unprecedented in human history, an empire based entirely on water, where political authority flowed along shipping routes, and diplomatic relationships were maintained through commercial partnerships, rather than conquest and occupation. The Maharaja of Srivijaya held court not in a massive palace complex designed to intimidate visitors with architectural grandeur, but in a setting that proclaimed his realm's true source of power, a ceremonial hall overlooking the harbor where the wealth of nations bobbed at anchor. The air was perfumed with sandalwood from Timor, cloves from the Moluccas, and the distinctive aroma of camphor from Sumatran forests, while silk hangings from China displayed patterns influenced by Indian aesthetics and executed with techniques learned from Persian craftsmen. When the Chinese monk Yi Jing visited Srivijaya in 671 CE, he found more than a prosperous trading center. He discovered a sophisticated cosmopolitan society where Buddhist scholarship flourished alongside commercial enterprise. The capital housed over 1,000 monks dedicated to teaching and training traveling scholars from across Asia, while the royal library contained texts in Chinese, Sanskrit, Pali, and local languages that represented the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizations. Pilgrims from China regularly stopped in Srivijaya for months or even years, studying Buddhist doctrine and learning local languages before continuing their journeys to the holy sites of India. Srivijaya's success depended on a fundamental insight about maritime commerce that would later be forgotten by land-based empires. The sea lanes could be controlled not through military occupation, but through the provision of essential services that made trade profitable and secure. Rather than simply taxing vessels that passed through their waters, Srivijayan authorities created an integrated system that combined transit fees with value-added services, harbor facilities, commercial information, security escorts, currency exchange and diplomatic protection that made their ports attractive to international merchants while generating substantial revenues for the royal treasury. The Srivijayan Navy represented a new form of naval power specifically designed for controlling maritime commerce, rather than conducting traditional military campaigns. Their vessels were built for speed and maneuverability rather than heavy combat, enabling them to patrol vast areas of ocean while responding quickly to reports of piracy or smuggling. More importantly, they developed diplomatic and intelligence networks that extended throughout the region, allowing them to anticipate and prevent conflicts that might disrupt commercial activities. The empire's approach to managing cultural diversity reflected the practical requirements of international commerce in an era when religious and ethnic differences could easily escalate into violence that would damage trade relationships. Srivijayan policies maintained remarkable tolerance for different religious traditions, allowing Hindu temples, Buddhist monasteries, and local shrines to coexist peacefully within their territories, while providing legal frameworks that could accommodate the commercial practices of diverse trading communities. This tolerance was not merely humanitarian, it reflected sophisticated understanding that international commerce required cultural environments where merchants from various backgrounds could operate comfortably while maintaining their own customs and religious observances. In Srivijayan ports, Islamic traders from Arabia could perform their prayers alongside Buddhist monks from China and Hindu merchants from India, while local officials provided legal systems that could adjudicate disputes involving parties from different cultural backgrounds operating under different commercial traditions. The influence of Srivijaya extended far beyond its immediate territorial boundaries through a network of tributary relationships that connected smaller kingdoms throughout Southeast Asia, in a loose confederation based on commercial advantage rather than military subordination. The rulers of Kedah, Chaya, and other regional centers acknowledged Srivijayan supremacy, not because they feared conquest, but because association with the maritime empire provided access to trade networks and diplomatic protection that enhanced their own prosperity. Archaeological evidence of Srivijayan influence has been found throughout Southeast Asia and beyond, in the form of distinctive artistic styles, architectural techniques, and luxury goods that demonstrate the empire's role as a cultural intermediary between different civilizations. The famous ship reliefs at Borobudur, commissioned by the allied Sailendra dynasty of Java, depict vessels using Srivijayan shipbuilding techniques and sail configurations, while Chinese ceramics found in East African archaeological sites likely passed through Srivijayan ports during their journey from Asian workshops to African markets. The empire's commercial networks reached their greatest extent during the 10th and 11th centuries, when Srivijayan merchants regularly traveled to China, India, Arabia, and even East Africa, while maintaining trading posts and diplomatic missions throughout the region. Chinese sources record that Srivijayan embassies to the Tang and Song courts brought exotic gifts, including African ivory, Arabian horses, and rare spices that could only have been obtained through extensive international trading relationships. However, Srivijaya's commercial success eventually attracted the attention of other powers seeking to control or disrupt the lucrative trade routes. In 1025 CE, the Chola Empire of South India launched a devastating naval attack on Srivijayan ports, systematically plundering the major trading centers and capturing the king himself. While the Cholas withdrew after securing substantial tribute, the attack demonstrated that even the most successful maritime empire remained vulnerable to determined military assault by powers willing to disrupt commerce for political advantage. The Chola invasion marked the beginning of Srivijaya's decline, but it also highlighted the inherent instability of commercial empires that depended on maintaining peaceful relationships with multiple potential rivals. Unlike territorial empires that could defend fixed boundaries, maritime empires like Srivijaya required the cooperation of numerous independent powers whose interests might change as economic or political circumstances evolved. The gradual decline of Srivijayan power during the 12th and 13th centuries coincided with the rise of new maritime powers that challenged the empire's control over Southeast Asian trade routes. The emergence of Majapahit in Java and the expansion of Chinese naval activities under the Song dynasty created alternative centers of maritime power, while the growth of Islamic influence in the region began to undermine Srivijaya's position as the primary intermediary between Hindu-Buddhist and Islamic trading networks. Yet even as Srivijaya's political power waned, the principles of maritime commerce that the empire had developed continued to influence commercial relationships throughout the region. The techniques for managing multicultural trade communities, the diplomatic protocols for maintaining peaceful relationships between competing commercial interests, and the administrative methods for coordinating complex international transactions became part of the institutional framework that would enable the maritime Silk Road to flourish, even after the collapse of the political systems that had initially organized it. The legacy of Srivijaya thus extends far beyond the specific achievements of a single empire to encompass the demonstration that maritime commerce could support sophisticated political and cultural institutions, capable of coordinating peaceful relationships across vast geographic areas and diverse cultural traditions. The thalassocratic model that Srivijaya pioneered would influence the development of later maritime empires, while establishing precedents for international cooperation that remained relevant long after the empire itself had dissolved into the complex web of commercial relationships that characterized the mature maritime Silk Road. The Chinese giant awakens, from rivers to oceans. For over a millennium, Chinese civilization had turned its back on the sea. The great rivers, the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Pearl, had provided the arteries of Chinese commerce, while the empire's attention focused on the northern frontiers, where nomadic threats required constant military vigilance. Chinese vessels were essentially fluvial craft, designed for river navigation and coastal fishing but lacking the seaworthiness necessary for deep ocean voyaging. When Chinese sources mentioned large ocean-going ships, they invariably described foreign vessels. The mysterious Kunlun Po of Southeast Asian merchants, whose sewn plank construction and exotic cargoes fascinated Chinese observers who had never ventured beyond sight of land. This began to change during the Song dynasty, when a combination of political necessity and commercial opportunity drove China to develop its own maritime capabilities.
The loss of overland Silk Road access due to conflicts with northern neighbors forced Chinese merchants to look seaward for alternative trade routes, while the growing prosperity of Southeast Asian maritime networks demonstrated the enormous profits available to powers that could effectively organize oceanic commerce. Most importantly, Chinese shipbuilders began learning from the Austronesian and Arab shipbuilders, whose vessels they encountered in growing numbers at Chinese ports. In the shipyards of Quanzhou and Guangzhou, Chinese craftsmen carefully examined the hull designs and construction techniques of foreign vessels, adapting and improving upon maritime technologies that had been perfected over millennia of tropical navigation. They adopted the watertight bulkhead construction that enabled ships to survive hull damage without sinking, borrowed the efficient rudder systems that provided better steering control, and developed new forms of rigging that could handle the variable wind conditions of monsoon navigation. Most importantly, they began building vessels specifically designed for deep-water sailing, rather than the river and coastal operations that had previously defined Chinese naval architecture. The transformation was remarkable in its speed and scope. Within a few generations, Chinese shipyards were producing vessels that dwarfed anything previously seen in Asian waters. Massive junks with multiple masts, sophisticated sail systems, and cargo capacities that enabled them to carry bulk goods economically across vast distances. These ships incorporated the best features of various maritime traditions, while adding distinctively Chinese innovations, such as the magnetic compass, which revolutionized navigation accuracy, and the use of iron nails and clamps that provided greater structural integrity than traditional lashing techniques. Chinese entry into maritime commerce during the Song dynasty coincided with a broader economic boom that transformed the character of international trade throughout the Indian Ocean basin. Chinese demand for Southeast Asian spices and aromatics stimulated production throughout the region, while Chinese exports of porcelain, silk, and manufactured goods created new markets and trading opportunities. The volume of maritime commerce increased dramatically as Chinese vessels joined the Austronesian, Arab, and Indian ships that had previously dominated oceanic trade. The efficiency and scale of Chinese maritime operations quickly established new patterns of international commerce. Chinese merchants could offer more competitive prices for bulk goods due to their larger vessels and more systematic approach to cargo handling, while Chinese products gained reputations for quality and reliability that opened markets throughout the Indian Ocean region. Chinese porcelain in particular became so prized that fragments of Song and Yuan dynasty ceramics have been found in archaeological sites from Japan to East Africa, testament to the global reach of Chinese maritime commerce.
However, it was during the Ming Dynasty that Chinese maritime power reached its zenith, with the extraordinary voyages of Admiral Zhang He and his treasure fleets. These expeditions represented something unprecedented in world history: state-sponsored naval operations on a scale that would not be matched until the modern era, designed not for conquest or colonization, but for diplomatic outreach and commercial expansion. The treasure ships themselves were marvels of naval architecture, over 400 feet long with 9 masts and crews of thousands, capable of carrying enormous cargoes while maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary for long-distance voyaging. The first treasure fleet that departed from Nanjing in 1405 included 317 ships and nearly 28,000 men, making it larger than most of the armies that contemporary European kingdoms could field. The fleet's composition reflected the sophisticated logistical planning that such operations required: massive treasure ships carrying diplomatic gifts and luxury trade goods, military vessels providing security, supply ships carrying food and fresh water, troop transports for diplomatic escorts, and specialized vessels for horses, medical supplies, and equipment maintenance. The preparation for these voyages required months of coordinated effort, involving thousands of workers throughout the Chinese Empire. At the Longjiang shipyard in Nanjing, shipbuilders constructed vessels using techniques that incorporated the accumulated maritime knowledge of multiple civilizations, while workshops throughout China produced the silk textiles, porcelain, lacquerware, and other luxury goods that would serve as diplomatic gifts for foreign rulers. The recruitment and training of crews involved not only skilled sailors and navigators, but also translators, cultural specialists, and diplomatic personnel who could manage the complex cultural negotiations that successful international relations required. Zhang He himself represented the cosmopolitan character of these expeditions. Born Ma He to a Muslim family in Yunnan, he had received both Chinese education and Islamic religious training, making him an ideal intermediary between different cultural traditions. His conversion to Buddhism and devotion to Tianfei, the patron goddess of sailors, reflected the syncretic religious approach that enabled Chinese expeditions to operate successfully in the diverse cultural environments they encountered throughout their voyages. The routes followed by the treasure fleets traced the established pathways of maritime Silk Road commerce, while extending Chinese influence into previously unexplored regions. The first 3 voyages reached Calicut on India's Malabar coast, following well-known commercial routes through Southeast Asia and across the Indian Ocean. The 4th voyage pushed further west to Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, bringing Chinese diplomats into direct contact with Middle Eastern powers for the first time. The final 3 voyages extended Chinese influence to the Arabian Peninsula and the East African coast, reaching as far as Malindi in modern Kenya and possibly beyond. The diplomatic achievements of these expeditions were as remarkable as their navigational accomplishments. Zhang Yi's fleet established formal diplomatic relationships with over 30 foreign kingdoms, many of which agreed to participate in the Chinese tributary system and send regular embassies to the Ming court. The Chinese approach to international relations differed significantly from the military conquest that characterized most imperial expansion. Instead of imposing Chinese rule on foreign territories, the treasure fleet sought to establish mutually beneficial relationships based on trade and diplomatic exchange. The cultural impact of the treasure fleets extended far beyond formal diplomacy to include systematic exchanges of knowledge, technology, and artistic traditions. Chinese scholars and craftsmen who accompanied the expeditions learned about foreign cultures and technologies while sharing Chinese innovations with their hosts. Medical knowledge, astronomical techniques, and engineering methods were exchanged along with commercial goods, while artistic traditions began incorporating motifs and techniques learned from international contacts. However, the very success of the treasure fleet expeditions created political tensions within the Chinese Empire that would ultimately lead to their termination. The Confucian scholar bureaucrats who dominated Chinese administration viewed the expeditions as wasteful displays that violated traditional Chinese values of frugality and self-sufficiency. They argued that the enormous costs of maintaining such fleets could be better spent on domestic projects and frontier defense. While the elevation of eunuch admirals like Zheng, he threatened their own political influence. The death of the Yongle Emperor in 1424 marked the beginning of the end for Chinese maritime expansion. His successors, influenced by Confucian advisors who opposed the expeditions on both fiscal and ideological grounds, gradually reduced support for naval operations, while redirecting resources toward land-based military campaigns against northern nomadic threats. The seventh and final treasure fleet voyage in 1431 to 1433 was conducted reluctantly, and when Zheng He died during the return journey, no one possessed the political influence necessary to continue the expeditions. The subsequent abandonment of Chinese maritime expansion represents one of the great turning points in world history. At the very moment when European explorers were beginning their tentative ventures into the Atlantic, China withdrew from oceanic exploration and commerce, leaving the sea lanes open for other powers to dominate. The destruction of Zheng He's navigation records and the deliberate neglect of Chinese naval capabilities ensured that China would play no role in the European colonial expansion that would reshape the global economy during the following centuries. Yet, the brief period of Chinese maritime supremacy had lasting effects on the development of international commerce and cultural exchange. The diplomatic relationships established by the treasure fleets continued to influence regional politics long after the expeditions ended, while the commercial networks that Chinese merchants had developed provided foundations for continued trade even without state support. The technological innovations and navigational knowledge that Chinese maritime expansion had generated influenced shipbuilding and navigation throughout the region, contributing to the overall advancement of maritime capabilities that would benefit all participants in oceanic commerce. The rise and sudden abandonment of Chinese maritime power thus illustrates both the enormous potential of coordinated state investment in oceanic exploration and the fragility of political support for such expensive and culturally challenging enterprises. The treasure fleet expeditions demonstrated what was possible when the world's most advanced civilization committed its resources to maritime expansion, while their termination showed how quickly such achievements could be lost when political priorities changed and cultural conservatism reasserted itself. The transformation of ocean worlds. As the monsoon winds that had carried Chinese treasure fleets to distant shores began to fill the sails of Portuguese caravels in the late 15th century, the maritime Silk Road entered its final phase as an indigenous Asian commercial system. The arrival of European naval forces in the Indian Ocean represented more than a change in maritime personnel. It marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in the character of oceanic commerce that would replace the relatively egalitarian trading networks of the medieval period with hierarchical colonial systems designed to channel wealth toward European metropolitan centers. The Portuguese capture of Malacca in 1511 symbolized this transformation most clearly. For nearly a millennium, Malacca had served as the great entrepot of Southeast Asian commerce, where merchants from every corner of Asia had gathered to exchange goods under the protection of local rulers, who profited from providing commercial services rather than attempting to monopolize trade. The diversity of Malacca's population, Malay, Javanese, Chinese, Indian, Arab, and Persian merchants living in distinct quarters while conducting business, according to established protocols that accommodated different cultural and religious traditions,
represented the cosmopolitan character that had made the maritime Silk Road a system of mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. Under Portuguese rule, this cosmopolitan commercial culture was systematically replaced with a colonial administration designed to maximize European profits while restricting Asian commercial autonomy. Portuguese authorities imposed licensing requirements on Asian merchants, established monopolies on the most profitable trade goods, and used military force to prevent indigenous traders from maintaining the independent commercial relationships that had previously characterized Indian Ocean commerce. The result was not more efficient trade but rather the destruction of commercial networks that had evolved over centuries to accommodate the diverse needs and capabilities of different cultural communities. The technological changes that accompanied European colonization were equally transformative. The sophisticated indigenous shipbuilding traditions that had created vessels perfectly adapted to tropical navigation conditions, stone plank construction that provided flexibility in rough seas, outrigger systems that offered stability without sacrificing speed, and sail configurations designed for monsoon navigation, gradually disappeared as European shipbuilding methods became dominant. The Zhong vessels of Southeast Asia, which had been among the largest and most seaworthy ships in the world, ceased to be built by the 17th century, while the dhows of the Arabian Sea and the junks of Chinese waters survived only in modified forms that incorporated European techniques. This technological transformation represented more than a simple improvement in maritime capabilities. It reflected the systematic disruption of knowledge systems that had been refined over millennia of oceanic experience. The oral traditions that preserved navigation techniques, the craft specializations that maintained shipbuilding quality, and the commercial practices that enabled peaceful trade between diverse communities, were gradually displaced by European methods that prioritized military control over commercial efficiency and cultural accommodation. The human cost of this transformation extended far beyond the merchants and craftsmen, whose livelihoods were disrupted by colonial policies. The maritime communities that had served as intermediaries between different cultural traditions, the multilingual traders who could negotiate between Chinese and Arab commercial practices, the skilled navigators who knew the seasonal patterns of winds and currents throughout the Indian Ocean, the diplomatic specialists who maintained peaceful relationships between potentially hostile communities, found their expertise devalued in colonial systems that preferred European administrative methods to indigenous knowledge. Yet the European colonial period also demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the commercial relationships that the maritime Silk Road had created. Despite systematic efforts to destroy indigenous commercial networks, many traditional trading patterns persisted in modified forms, while Asian merchants developed new strategies for maintaining profitable commercial relationships under colonial restrictions. The dhow trade between Arabia and East Africa continued throughout the colonial period, while Chinese merchants maintained commercial connections with Southeast Asia even when official diplomatic relationships were severed. The spice trade that had originally motivated European intervention in Indian Ocean commerce ironically became one of the areas where traditional patterns proved most persistent. European colonial authorities could control the major ports and impose taxes on large-scale commercial operations, but they lacked the local knowledge and cultural connections necessary to manage the complex networks of small-scale traders who actually collected spices in remote growing areas and transported them to major markets. As a result, much of the actual spice trade continued to operate according to traditional patterns, even when the profits were ultimately channeled toward European colonial enterprises. The Manila-Acapulco galleon trade that connected Asian goods with Spanish colonial markets in the Americas represented a new form of oceanic commerce that bypassed the traditional Indian Ocean routes entirely. Chinese porcelain and silk, Southeast Asian spices, and other Asian luxury goods were shipped across the Pacific to Mexico and then carried overland to Atlantic ports for transshipment to Europe, creating the first permanent trans-Pacific trade route, while reducing the importance of Indian Ocean commerce for connecting Asian production with European consumption. This development had profound effects on the traditional maritime Silk Road, as merchants who had previously relied on Indian Ocean routes to reach Western markets found their services no longer essential for the most profitable forms of international commerce. However, the Pacific route also created new opportunities for Asian merchants who could adapt to the requirements of trans-Pacific trade, while the continued European demand for Asian goods ensured that commercial relationships throughout the region remained active, even when their ultimate destinations changed. The intellectual and cultural exchanges that had characterized the classical maritime Silk Road also persisted in modified forms during the colonial period. European scholars and administrators who lived in Asian ports often developed deep appreciation for local knowledge systems, while Asian intellectuals gained access to European scientific and technical knowledge through colonial educational institutions. These exchanges were often unequal and conducted within colonial power relationships, but they nevertheless maintained the tradition of cross-cultural learning that had always characterized oceanic commerce. The missionary activities that accompanied European colonial expansion similarly created new forms of cultural exchange that paralleled the religious transmission that had occurred along traditional trade routes. While European missionaries often attempted to replace local religious traditions with Christianity, the actual results were usually more complex, producing syncretic religious systems that combined elements from various traditions, while adapting to local cultural conditions. These developments continued the pattern of religious innovation and adaptation that had characterized the maritime Silk Road throughout its history. Archaeological evidence from European colonial sites throughout the Indian Ocean region reveals the persistence of traditional commercial and cultural patterns, even under colonial administration. Chinese porcelain, Southeast Asian ceramics, and Indian textiles continued to circulate throughout the region, while local craft traditions adapted European techniques and motifs to create new forms of artistic expression that reflected both cultural continuity and adaptation to changing circumstances. The gradual decline of European colonial control during the 19th and 20th centuries created opportunities for the revival of some traditional commercial patterns, while the development of modern transportation and communication technologies enabled new forms of oceanic commerce that transcended the limitations of both traditional sailing vessels and colonial administrative systems. The container shipping and air freight networks that carry the bulk of modern international trade follow many of the same routes that were pioneered by Austronesian navigators and Arab merchants thousands of years ago, while the commercial relationships between Asian countries often reflect patterns established during the classical maritime Silk Road period. The cultural legacy of the maritime Silk Road similarly persists in the cosmopolitan port cities that remain centers of international commerce throughout the Indian Ocean region. Singapore, Mumbai, Colombo, and other major ports continue to host diverse communities of international merchants who conduct business in multiple languages while accommodating different cultural and religious traditions, maintaining the tradition of commercial multiculturalism that had characterized oceanic trade for millennia. Navigating time's currents, the eternal ocean. As the last traditional sailing vessels slowly disappeared from the major shipping lanes of the Indian Ocean during the early 20th century, replaced by steam-powered cargo ships that could ignore the monsoon patterns that had governed oceanic navigation for thousands of years. The maritime Silk Road appeared to have ended forever. The ancient rhythms of seasonal departure and return, the patient accumulation of cultural knowledge necessary for successful cross-cultural trade, and the intimate relationship between human communities and oceanic environments seemed irrelevant in an age of mechanical propulsion and electronic navigation. Yet, beneath the surface transformations that had accompanied European colonization and industrial modernization, deeper patterns of oceanic connection persisted. The commercial relationships that connected spice gardens in Indonesia with markets in India, the cultural networks that linked Buddhist communities across Southeast Asia, and the family connections that maintained trade partnerships between communities separated by thousands of miles of ocean, continued to function, even when the political and technological frameworks that had originally supported them had disappeared. The monsoon winds that had first enabled systematic oceanic navigation continued to blow with the same seasonal regularity that had governed ancient voyages, while the ocean currents that had guided navigators toward distant islands maintained the same patterns that Austronesian voyagers had learned to read millennia earlier. The natural infrastructure that had made the maritime Silk Road possible remained intact, waiting for new generations of navigators to rediscover the principles of oceanic commerce that had once connected half the world through peaceful trade relationships. Modern archaeological discoveries have begun to reveal the true scope and sophistication of the maritime networks that flourished long before European exploration, while linguistic and genetic research has demonstrated the extent of cultural exchange that oceanic commerce had enabled throughout the region. The shipwrecks that dot the floor of the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia to East Africa tell stories of commercial relationships maintained across vast distances and diverse cultural traditions, while the distribution of artifacts and technologies provides evidence of systematic knowledge exchange that influenced human development throughout the region. The outrigger vessels that still ply the waters of Indonesia and the Philippines represent living links to the maritime traditions that once dominated oceanic commerce, while traditional navigation techniques continue to be practiced in remote areas where modern technology has not completely displaced indigenous knowledge systems. The annual festivals that celebrate oceanic connections and communities throughout the Indian Ocean region maintain cultural memories of the time when the sea served as a highway rather than a barrier, connecting rather than separating the diverse peoples who inhabited its shores. In the great ports of the modern Indian Ocean, Singapore's container terminals, Mumbai's commercial districts, Colombo's international harbor, the descendants of ancient maritime merchants continue to conduct business according to principles that would be familiar to their ancestors, who traded silk and spices across the same waters centuries ago. The languages spoken in these cosmopolitan centers still reflect the multilingual heritage of oceanic commerce, while the cultural institutions that serve diverse immigrant communities maintain traditions of accommodation and cooperation that had made peaceful trade possible across cultural boundaries. The modern revival of interest in traditional navigation and shipbuilding techniques has demonstrated that the knowledge systems that enabled the maritime Silk Road were not primitive technologies superseded by European innovation, but sophisticated adaptations to oceanic environments that often performed better than modern alternatives under specific conditions. Experimental voyages using traditional vessels and navigation methods have successfully replicated ancient voyages, proving that the achievements of early maritime peoples represented genuine mastery of oceanic environments rather than fortunate accidents.
The contemporary emphasis on sustainable transportation and renewable energy has also created new appreciation for maritime technologies that utilized wind and current power rather than fossil fuels, while the growing awareness of climate change has highlighted the environmental wisdom embedded in traditional practices that worked with natural systems rather than attempting to dominate them. The principles of oceanic navigation that enabled the maritime Silk Road offer valuable insights for developing modern transportation systems that can function efficiently while minimizing environmental impact. Perhaps most importantly, the maritime Silk Road demonstrated that complex international relationships based on mutual benefit and cultural respect were not only possible but could prove more durable and productive than systems based on competition and domination. The commercial networks that connected Asia, Africa, and eventually Europe through oceanic trade created prosperity that was widely shared, while enabling cultural exchanges that enriched every participating society. The legacy of the maritime Silk Road thus extends far beyond its historical importance to encompass principles of international cooperation that remain relevant for addressing contemporary global challenges. The demonstration that diverse cultures could maintain peaceful and profitable relationships across vast distances, while preserving their distinct identities, offers hope for creating modern international systems that can accommodate cultural diversity, while promoting economic development and environmental sustainability. As cargo ships powered by wind and solar energy begin to appear on modern shipping routes, and as international trade agreements increasingly emphasize cultural preservation and environmental protection, the wisdom embedded in ancient oceanic commerce becomes newly relevant. The navigators who first learned to read the monsoon winds and the merchants who created networks of trust across cultural boundaries pioneered approaches to international relationship that anticipated many of the challenges facing the modern globalized world. In the gentle swell of the Indian Ocean that continues to rise and fall with the same rhythm that lifted Austronesian outriggers and Chinese treasure ships, the legacy of the maritime Silk Road endures. The principles of cooperation, adaptation, and respect for natural systems that enabled ancient oceanic commerce remain available to guide contemporary efforts to create sustainable and equitable forms of international relationship. The sea that once carried spices and silk between distant shores continues to offer its services to those who approach it with the wisdom and humility that characterized the greatest maritime civilizations of the past. The story of the maritime Silk Road thus becomes not simply a historical account of ancient commerce, but a meditation on the possibility of creating human relationships that work in harmony with natural systems, while celebrating the diversity that makes cultural exchange both challenging and rewarding. In an age when technological capability far exceeds the wisdom to use it responsibly, the example of maritime peoples who created sustainable prosperity through patient cooperation across cultural differences offers both inspiration and practical guidance for navigating the uncertain waters of the future.